Hi, I'm Tom Besford, Chief Executive of English Folk Expo, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how I plan projects. So, a project can be anything: a gig, a tour, a commission, an exhibition, it could be a festival, it could be a songwriters camp, a mentoring session, or even, in fact, I use this technique to plan my own wedding. Um, I'm going to talk about the initial stages, how you know whether it's viable, and what the first steps are to getting things off the ground. So I might have an idea in my head, and probably it could be quite well formulated, but maybe I haven't explained it to anyone, I haven't necessarily articulated it properly. And what I need to do is get into a situation where I know what the scope and scale of it is, and how I know if it's going to be viable, which partners I might need to involve. And for me, the first thing I do is I open an Excel document and I start a spreadsheet. Now, that spreadsheet is going to be the foundations of my budget. So I have four columns on my spreadsheet. The first is always what the thing is I'm going to talk about. The second column is usually the expenditure, anything that's going to cost me anything. The third column is usually anything that I think is income, whatever that might be. And the fourth column is any notes or comments that I need to write to myself. And the very first thing I do is, in no order about anything, I just write down in the very first column, these are all the things that I think this is going to cost to do this project. It could be artist fees, it could be accommodation, it could be insurance, it could be travel, it could be catering, and you might not really have any idea about what those are. So just kind of think for a second, okay, well, accommodation. I reckon there's going to be this many people staying, there are going to be this many nights, and I'll build it as a little formula within the expenditure line. So I'll say 5 people times 4 nights times, I don't know, £80 a room, £90 a room, whatever I think is about what I'm going to get a hotel room for. I just put that in. And I do that for every single line I can possibly think of, just everything. Um, right down to, I think it's going to cost me this much to have this many bits of paper printed, or I'm going to need to buy some stuff for a production office. I'm going to have to buy some pens or some whatever it might be, more printer ink, anything like that. And then once I have thought about everything I can possibly imagine spending money on, I'm going to then stick another line in there called contingency, and I'm going to start off by putting 10%. That might change, but I'm just going to put 10% of everything that I'm imagining I'm going to spend. I'm going to stick another 10% of that on top to give me a bit of a buffer. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the income line. But I'm also going to delineate in the income line what I know I've got. Look, my budget for this project is £1,000, £10,000, £100,000, whatever it might be. Um, and and I'm going to say, okay, well, I know that I've got this much money to play with, to spend. I think I'm going to sell this many tickets at this price, so I'm going to put that in. And I know that I'm going to apply to this funder or that funder for this bit of money, this amount of money. And I'm going to write those into my income lines, what I think is realistic. I might, if I'm being extra cautious, again, take 10% off the earned income line. So how many tickets I'm going to sell. Maybe I think I'm going to sell 100 tickets. Maybe I think I'm going to sell 1,000 tickets. I might just take 10% off that, again, to give me a little bit more buffer room. And then, and only then, I'm going to then sum up the two columns. And I'm going to see how far apart the expenditure line and the income line is. Now, what never happens is that the income line is massively greater than the expenditure line, and you go, oh my goodness, we've got this project done, sorted. What tends to happen is the expenditure line is much greater than you imagine, and the income line is much smaller than you imagine. And at that point, I've just spent a bit of time back and forth with the spreadsheet. Well, what if we did it this way, if we did it that way? And I'm not trying to do myself out of the nature of it. What I'm actually doing there is subconsciously, I guess I'm reformulating the scale or the scope of the project within line of what the income is going to be. And I've just faff about with that spreadsheet for ages until I've got it to a point that I know works, which might be ideally a break even, amazingly ideally, maybe even a small contribution. to the bottom line in terms of profit or something I can reinvest elsewhere. So I've got my budget spreadsheet done, and I know that the project and the scale that I'm imagining is viable, or at least I think it is. I know what my income targets I need to find are, either by selling tickets or by raising money another way. And then I'm going to look at all that, and I usually then try and organize the spreadsheet by just moving the rows around into rough settings. Artist costs in one area, production costs in another, whatever that might be. And from there, I then get up another spreadsheet or another tab, and I start with the event, and then I map it backwards from the event all the way back to now. And what I'm making sure that I'm doing is that every single line in my budget, income and expenditure, has a place in that timeline. So I know when I'm going to need to spend something by, I know when I need to have achieved certain income targets by. So for example, if I've got a funding bid that I know that I've got to have to write, then along that timeline will be the deadline for the funding application to go in, and also when I expect to hear. And then I know, well, the project might stop at that point, but if I get the money, then I've got these next steps to progress. So I'm writing this timeline, I'm making sure that it fits in the length of time that I've imagined. Usually it takes quite a bit longer than when I first created the idea for this project. Actually, it might take a little bit longer than I thought so when I've timelined it out. Then I look at the timeline, I look at the budget, I check that those two things make sense and they marry up. And then what I tend to do is I leave it for a day, maybe two. Maybe I'll send it to a friend or a colleague, to someone else to read through it. And I'll come back to it and I'll look at it again with fresh eyes and I'll say, okay, maybe I was being a bit too ambitious with the ticket sales. Maybe actually that timeline is just not quite working. Maybe the project isn't what I imagined it in the first place and I need to start reshaping some of it. So I'll kind of repeat the whole process again until I've got a budget and a timeline that I'm happy with. At that point, I then try and articulate in a Word document of some sort the project. I want to know, I'm basically padding out the timeline to start with, but then I start chopping out the very practical things and start talking about the reasons why we're doing it and what the important factors are. So it's very important at that point. I might have known these things all along, but I might not have articulated them so succinctly that I'm going to say something like, this project is for these people, and I want to do it for these reasons, and this is why we're going to work with these people, and this is why we're going to work with these people. This is why I'm going to that funder. I'm giving the rationale, the justification. It helps me when I'm explaining it to other people because I've got it succinct. I've got it written down. I think it's called the elevator pitch. I know how to describe it to somebody clearly so that they get it as well. And then I am going to write all that up, probably try and get it into a couple of pages. And at that point, that document then becomes the basis that I use for other things. So then that might be the basis for writing a funding application. It might be a board paper that I need to get approval from. It might be information I send out to partners to get them enthused about the project or to make sure that they're up to date and that they understand what we're collectively trying to do and to make sure we're all on the same page. It might even be the foundation for a press release. But essentially, at that point, then I know that I'm good to go and deliver the project. So, yeah, I think at that point you crack on, I suppose. So that is how I start planning any project of any scale, whether I'm talking about a gig in my local in my local bar for 20 or 30 people, or whether I'm talking about English Folk Expo's business plan for the next 4 years. It all starts in exactly the same way every time. I hope that was of some help. Thanks very much.